In this video, I will provide an introduction to your immune system. The key function of the immune system is to provide protection against the many pathogens that are trying to invade you from the outside environment. This includes viruses and bacteria and other single-celled organisms known as protozoans. Your body uses not only defensive cells, but a variety of other chemicals that can help provide some immunity. The immune system also deactivates toxins that are produced by pathogens, such as bacteria, and ideally also destroys any mutated body cells, which if left alone would go on to cause cancer. The immune system itself does not have a distinct structure. It functions within the lymphatic system, which is why we talked about that first. So you have your lymph vessels that carry the lymph around the body, the various lymph nodes and lymph nodules in various parts of the body, and that is where you find many of the important cells that are part of your immune system. But there are some immune cells that travel in the blood and are found in connective tissue, which of course is everywhere in your body, or in the interstitial fluid between your cells. The defensive responses your immune system enacts involves these special cells. They're called either leukocytes, which are your white blood cells like neutrophils, or lymphocytes, which are also blood cells, but they have been matured in a special way to produce a more specific response, and we'll get into that in a minute, along with various chemicals and proteins that act to destroy these pathogens. The response of your immune system can be general, just sort of this is what always happens when something comes into the body, or specifically tailored to a particular pathogen. And these specific responses can be remembered so that the body can respond quicker if this pathogen comes through your body a second time. Before we get into details in the immune system, we need to talk a bit about antigens. So antigens are molecules on the surface of cell membranes that cause a particular immune response. These molecules are typically some kind of protein or carbohydrate, a polysaccharide, or some combination, like a glycoprotein would be a carbohydrate and a protein, or a glycolipid is a carbohydrate and a lipid. The antigens serve as markers that identify cells as belonging to yourself, so they are your own cells, or they don't belong to yourself. And your immune system normally only responds to cells that are marked with not the correct signposts. They're marked as non-self cells, and then your body knows this is potentially a foreign invader and needs to be taken care of. So let's first talk about this general response, the standard protection that happens against a variety of pathogens. Doesn't matter what kind of pathogen it is, the body always responds the same way. First of all, before we get into particular details, many things we have a genetic resistance to. For example, you can't catch particular diseases from your pets, and they can't catch particular diseases from you because these diseases are species specific. And you yourself as an individual may be more resistant to a particular pathogen and less likely to become sick just because of your own particular genetic code. But outside of an innate genetic resistance, some of the standard ways that your body protects you, first of all, whenever you do get a break in your skin and you have an inflammation occur, that's because there's been increased blood flow and there's also been some plasma released into the tissues, which brings those white blood cells known as leukocytes that can help attack pathogens, and then the lymphocytes that are able to get a specific response, and macrophages, which are phagocytic and can clean up the debris. And so all these cells are brought in by this increased blood flow and increased fluid flow in the area that has inflammation. Also, areas that are inflamed also seem a little bit hot, and this increased temperature helps your white blood cells of all types actually work a little better. They work a little faster, they're a little warmer, and the higher temperatures also tend to restrict the activity of pathogens like bacteria and viruses. So the higher temperature, the heat you feel at inflammation, or the fever you run with particular illnesses is actually a good thing because your body is speeding up your own immune response and slowing down the action of the pathogens. There are also many, many physical and chemical barriers between you and the outside world to try to prevent pathogens from getting in. For example, your skin and the mucous membranes that line all of the openings that are tubes that are open to the outside, like your digestive system or your urinary tract, are there with they're a wall. It's an actual physical barrier to prevent things from getting in. You also have good bacteria that colonize skin, both inside and out, to help provide protection in that they're sort of taking up all the space, and harmful bacteria have a harder time finding a place to live. Fluids such as tears or urine or sweat can actually wash pathogens away from the body, so physically removing them that way. And inside these fluids, we have various enzymes and acids that can work to destroy pathogens before they can do damage. So your tears contain an enzyme that break down bacteria. And of course, your stomach is very high, it's a very low pH number, so a very acidic, very high acid environment. And even the fat that's produced to keep your skin moist, the sebum that's released by the sebaceous glands in your skin, is slightly acidic, and again, it prevents the proliferation of bacteria on the surface of your skin. There are special proteins, a chemical that's not alive called defensins, that are given off by the leukocytes, such as neutrophils and basophils and eosinophils, which actually destroy the cell membrane of bacteria and fungi. So it causes the cell membrane to break down, and once the membrane integrity has been lost, those cells will die. Cells that have been infected by a virus produce another chemical known as an interferon, and this interferes with the viruses reproducing and infecting other cells. And then there are proteins known as complement proteins that travel in the blood, in the plasma, and they also encourage inflammation, because inflammation is actually a healthy response, encourage the cells that can engulf and digest pathogens such as macrophages, encourage them to be more phagocytic, and then also can cause destruction of bacteria by breaking down the cell membrane again. So as you can see, there's a long list of chemical responses against pathogens. And then there are cells that are defensive cells that are not specific to a particular pathogen, but just again will attack anything that comes by. The first kind is called a natural killer cell. So it's a type of lymphocyte. So it's going to be present in your lymph nodes and lymph nodules and in the lymphatic vessels. And natural killer cells produce chemicals called perforins that perforate, that put a hole in the cell membrane of cells that have been infected by viruses or are malignant, are cancer cells. And so they cause those cells to fall apart. And this little illustration over here is trying to show some natural killer cells attacking a virus-infected cell. And by putting a hole in that cell membrane, that cell then will fall apart and die. Cells that naturally are phagocytic, ones that can engulf other smaller substances and take it in and digest and break that substance down, include our macrophages, which really travel all over the body, and then neutrophils, which are the ones that are primarily found in pus when you've had an infection. Most of the content of pus are not neutrophils that have eaten as much as they can and then they die. Eosinophils and the dendritic cells, which are found in the skin area, they are all phagocytic cells that will move around and eat something that they run into that's not you. And then other types of leukocytes, basophils, and mast cells, which are found in connective tissue, help encourage inflammation and sort of call these phagocytic cells to an area to help clean things up. So that's the general response that happens no matter what the pathogen is. But we're also able to have a specific response to a particular pathogen. And because of that, we can develop an immunity that sticks around because there's a memory that is held of that particular pathogen. So these memory cells allow a faster response the next time. There are two types of specific or adaptive immunity. There are one that primarily involves cells, and in particular, it's our T cell lymphocytes, and again, these macrophages, which just show up all over the place. And then there are antibody-mediated response, which involves B cells as well as T cells and macrophages. Antibody-mediated is also called humoral immunity because it involves the fluids, because the antibodies are found in the various fluids around the body. So let's go through this cell-mediated response first. This response is effective against viruses, fungi, and cancer cells, not so much bacteria, but some of the other things that are potential problems. And the first thing that happens is that a macrophage runs into one of these pathogens and eats it, phagocytizes it, so engulfs it and digests, and then takes the antigen and basically makes it stick out on the surface of the macrophage. So it's kind of running around, holding up this antigen saying, look what I found, this doesn't belong to you, somebody needs to take care of it. The macrophage then connects with a helper T cell, a particular type of T cell, typically in the lymphatic system, so in a lymph node. And this helper T cell has a receptor that matches the antigen. So in your cell-mediated response, in the specific adaptive immunity, you have receptors on cells that match antigens, and that starts the whole process. When the match is found, this helper T cell is activated and goes on to divide many times. Some of the T cells are going to just remain as memory cells, but it also makes cytotoxic T cells, which these cyto means cell, toxic, of course, will kill. So these are specific cell-killing T cells, not just general natural killer cells, but ones that pinpoint cells that have been infected by a particular pathogen. There are various chemicals that are secreted in this process, both to speed up the reproduction of these T cells and also to attract the other leukocytes, the other supporting white blood cells. So the cytotoxic T cells destroy foreign cells or pathogens by basically, again, connecting to those infected cells and putting a hole in the cell membrane. And then because that's making a big mess, the cytotoxic T cells release the chemicals known as cytokines, which will cause the macrophages to come clean up the debris. So the macrophages are both a patrolling cell looking for pathogens and a cleanup cell, which can take all the bits of pieces of broken cells and digest them and get them out of your lymph or out of your plasma, wherever the macrophage happens to find it in your body. So here's a diagram that's showing this process. So we have, here's our helper T cell that hasn't been activated yet, but it has this receptor on top that can match a particular pathogen. And there are millions of different receptors present on our immune cells. This is all being made by your body with a lot of variation so that any shape of antigen that might possibly come into you, has a good chance of having a lymphocyte that would connect up to it. So here the macrophage is engulfing this foreign substance, and then it's putting the antigen on its surface. There's a particular receptor that is made to hold it. And then we see the T cell coming in that will connect to that receptor. And so then this T cell is going to be activated. It's basically knowing that, it's being alerted to do its job. And so it goes on to reproduce. It clones itself over and over and over again. And out of the particular, clones that are being made, you have ones that go on to become cytotoxic T cells, which can go kill cells directly. Some of those T cells become helper cells to activate more T cells and to create, call in some more members of the team, the macrophages and the various leukocytes. And then some of them also will go on to become memory cells that will just remain in your body for the rest of your life, ready to get started on this whole process faster the second time. So that's your cell-mediated response. The other type of adaptive or specific immunity is the antibody-mediated response. And antibodies are effective against bacteria as well as viruses, fungi, and the toxins that are produced by bacteria. So in the antibody-mediated response, you have B cells that get activated when the antigen is presented to them by a helper T cell or just by macrophage, or the B cell itself runs into the antigen. So again, you have to have the antigen present from the pathogen, but it's going to activate a receptor. There is going to be a B cell with the right kind of receptor present on its cell membrane that when it connects with this antigen, the B cell gets alerted and awakened and ready to do its job. And so the activated B cell starts to divide and divide. Some of those will become memory B cells that will just hang out in your body, ready for the next time. And other ones become what's known as plasma cells. And plasma cells are the ones that make the antibodies. Antibodies are a protein, so it's not another cell, and they can attach to these antigens on the pathogen cell. And what it does, basically, the antibodies clump up the cells and mark them for destruction by the macrophages or the other chemicals that are part of the immune response. So the antibodies don't destroy the pathogen cells directly, but they make it easier for the other parts of your immune system to find these pathogens and destroy them. Antibodies, again, as I said, are not a cell. It's just a protein, and it has a Y shape. And on the short legs of the Y is where you'll have the binding site. So it's on these ends here that will match the particular antigens. You can see there's 5 different types of antibodies shown, and they're basically a Y shape that are either, singly as a Y or connected up in various arrangements. These particular antibodies are found in different places in your body and are involved in different immune responses. So each antibody matches one particular antigen, and again, millions of possibilities can be made by your body. They're found pretty much in all of the fluids around your body, from your blood to your lymph to the tears and the moisture in your mucous membranes, all those places where pathogens might be present. And then, as I already mentioned, they basically are labels on a pathogen, which makes it easier for the other parts of your immune system to find them. So this diagram is showing you the pathway where you have a B cell with its receptor that's going to connect with a particular antigen and then become activated, and then it will divide many, many times. It clones itself and either makes plasma cells that go on to produce these antibodies or become a memory T cell that will stick around to provide a memory of that response. And then this illustration over here is just showing you how the antibodies can cause bacteria cells. Bacteria, remember, are very, very small, much smaller than our regular body cells, but it can clump them together and make it easier for the macrophage to take a big bite to destroy them all at once instead of trying to pick off little bacteria one at a time. So when we have a response, in this particular slide I'm going to show you that has the graph is looking at antibodies, but that really refers to all of our cells with the memory cells. But the first exposure to an antigen, it takes about 5 to 10 days for your body to kind of ramp up its antibody production to get your T cells activated and reproduced in a sufficient amount so that you're really finally making a dent in this pathogen and stopping its population growth and stopping its effect on you. So you can think of a cold, for an example. A cold lasts 7 to 10 days, and we have a lot of different kinds of colds out there. So every time you get a cold, you're probably getting a new cold. You haven't seen this particular virus before, and so it's going to take, this 5 to 10 days. That's how long it takes your body to get ramped up and ready to clear this pathogen out of your system. But when you're exposed, if you happen to be exposed to that same pathogen a second time, it's a much faster response. And so if we're looking at antibodies as a way to measure how much your body is responding, how your immune system is responding, the antibodies can be detected in just 1 to 2 days instead of 5 to 10 days. So you can see it's much, much faster. And the same thing is true about those other cells that are involved in your immune system. And so because there is this memory function that's present in the adaptive immunity side of your immune system, you get a much quicker response the second or third or fourth time you run into a particular pathogen, and you may not even realize that you've been exposed to that pathogen because your body responds so quickly you never feel sick. Here's a graph that tries to show how that works using some arbitrary hypothetical numbers, but somebody's exposed to the pathogen and tracking antibody levels in the blood. We get a peak here, and this finally gets defeated, and the memory cells are sitting there, so we haven't gone back to zero. There's a very low level. But then the second time this exposure happens, you can see there's a much steeper curve. It's going to respond much quicker. It actually responds, much stronger. We get to a much larger number. This is the same thing that happens if you get a vaccination for a particular disease. The vaccination causes that first exposure, but because the memory is present, if you should happen to get exposure to that particular, say the measles virus, you get a measles vaccine and you have memory cells for measles in your body. And then if you happen to run into a measles virus, you get this wonderful, quick, intense response, and you're able to fight off that virus and not get sick. So immunity is something you can acquire with this adaptive or specific immunity, and it can be acquired naturally or artificially. Naturally, it can be because you have actively run into one of those pathogens and these memory cells have been produced, like I've just talked about. But there also is an amount of passive immunity that comes naturally just when you are born, because antibodies are very small proteins and they can pass from your mother through the placenta to you before you are born. So when babies are born, they don't have a very active immune system. It's not really functioning yet because it hasn't been exposed to anything, and you have to be exposed to stuff to develop the memory cells. But if you have some antibodies already present from your mother, you're already ready to fight off some of the bacteria and viruses that you might run into in those first couple weeks when you're out into the world. And then you can acquire an immunity without naturally having to get sick or naturally getting it from your mother. As I mentioned, vaccines, if you're inoculated with usually a killed or a very weak form of a pathogen, then your body produces the antibodies and the specialized cells without you having to be sick first to get that response. Or you can actually get doses of antibodies in a shot in response to perhaps you're traveling to a part of the world that has a particular disease that you don't want to take the chances of getting, or when COVID-19 the pandemic was really at its height. Antibody therapy was one of the things people who had and successfully fought off the virus could donate some of their plasma, and the antibodies then could be given to somebody else. So you can actually receive antibodies. Antibodies don't stick around a really long time, so it's kind of a short-term process when you're not making them, when you're not having your memory cells, because it's the B cells really that hold the memory of making the antibodies. The antibodies themselves eventually will break down in your body. But because they do stick around for a couple of months, you can get a sort of a boost of antibodies for a particular situation. And this is something that often happens if you travel into other countries. It might be recommended. So just check your understanding. Can you answer these questions? If not, I suggest you go back and find the parts in the video that pertain to it. But my first question, what is an antigen and why are antigens important for proper functioning of the immune system? Can you describe at least 3 of the mechanisms of innate immunity, that general, non-specific response that your body does? Can you outline the steps in cell-mediated immunity or the steps in antibody-mediated immunity? And can you explain why your body responds faster to a repeat exposure to a pathogen? So this finishes my overview of the immune system.